The security guard's hand closed around Adrian Carter's arm before he could finish saying his own name, and Victoria Harrington watched it happen, with her chin lifted, satisfied, certain she had just protected her boardroom from an intruder. She had no idea she was about to throw $400 million and the only lifeline her company had left straight out the door with him, 90 days. That's all Harrington Technologies had left before the lights went out for good. And in the next 5 minutes, its CEO would make a decision that would follow her for the rest of her life. If you're watching this from a small town, drop your state in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels today. And if stories like this hit you right in the chest, hit subscribe, because we've got 4 more parts coming, and you don't want to miss where this one ends up. The conference room on the 41st floor of the Sterling Tower had a name, officially the Meridian Room, but everyone at Harrington Technologies just called it the room where deals die or deals live. Glass walls on 2 sides. A view of the river that most people never got to actually look at because they were too busy sweating through whatever pitch had brought them there. A long table of dark walnut polished so many times it had stopped reflecting light and started reflecting people instead, like a still pond. At 9:47 on a Tuesday morning in early spring, Victoria Harrington stood at the head of that table, straightening a stack of printed decks that didn't need straightening because her hands needed something to do. She was 44 years old. She had built Harrington Technologies up from a 14-person startup in a rented office above a dry cleaner to a company that had at its peak 3 years ago been valued at just under $1 billion. She had been on the cover of 2 business magazines. She had given a commencement speech at her alma mater about betting on yourself. She had for most of her adult life been the smartest person in almost every room she walked into, and she had built a personality brittle armored effective around making sure everyone else in the room knew it too. Now the company was hemorrhaging. A product line that had been rushed to market 18 months ago had failed spectacularly. 2 rounds of layoffs hadn't stopped the bleeding. The board had given her language that sounded polite in the minutes, but meant something else entirely: 90 days to secure new capital, or we begin exploring a sale, a breakup, or worse. Worse being the word nobody wanted to say out loud. Worse being 2,200 employees finding out their jobs didn't exist anymore all at once on a Friday by email. She had been chasing investors for 4 months. She had sat through 41 meetings. She had been told no by every venture fund on the East Coast that returned her calls and ignored by most of the ones that didn't. Every single conversation had circled back to the same 2 words spoken in different tones of regret: too risky. And then 3 weeks ago, her CFO, Daniel Ruiz, had come into her office holding his phone like it was something fragile. "There's interest," he'd said. "Real interest." From who? Carter Legacy Capital. Victoria had looked up sharply. Everyone in the industry knew that name, even people who'd never spoken to anyone who worked there. Carter Legacy Capital was infamous in the good sense, if there was a good sense, for stepping into companies that everyone else had already written off. Running the numbers no one else bothered to run, and coming out the other side with returns that made the funds who'd passed look foolish in hindsight. They didn't do many deals, but when they did one, it moved markets. "They reached out?" Victoria had asked. "Not exactly," Daniel said. "Their office reached out to schedule something. Said their principal had been reviewing our technology independently for months. Said he wanted to meet in person before making any decision." "Which principal?" Daniel had checked his notes. "Just says A. Carter. No first name given. Executive assistant handled the scheduling." Victoria had felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in weeks. Hope unfamiliar and almost painful after so long without it. She had pictured without meaning to exactly what A. Carter would look like walking into her boardroom, because in her mind, without her ever consciously deciding it, the picture had already been drawn. Gray suit, silver hair or none, a certain posture that came from decades of sitting at the heads of tables like this one. A voice pitched low and unhurried, the voice of someone who had never once in his life had to raise it to be heard. She had built the whole man in her head before she'd ever laid eyes on him. That was the first mistake. It just wasn't the one that would cost her everything. At 9:52, her assistant Priya stuck her head through the door. 10 minutes. I know, Victoria said. She smoothed the front of her blazer charcoal gray tailored, the kind of thing that cost more than some of her employees made in a month, though she genuinely never thought about it that way. It was just what she wore the same way other people wore whatever they wore. Is the room set? Water, coffee, the deck's loaded on the display. Legals standing by if you need them pulled in. Good. Victoria exhaled. Priya. Yeah. If this goes well, if this actually goes well, remind me to give you a raise. You've been putting up with a lot from me lately. Priya smiled a little surprised, like the words had cost Victoria something to say which they had. I'll hold you to that. Victoria almost smiled back. Almost. Because underneath the calm, underneath the practiced posture of a CEO who had learned to project confidence, even when there was nothing underneath it, she was terrified. She had put everything, every dollar of her own savings, that she was willing to admit, to every ounce of the reputation she'd spent 2 decades constructing, into a company that was now 90 days from ceasing to exist. And the only person standing between that ending and some other ending was a stranger whose face she'd never seen walking through her door in 8 minutes. She checked her phone. No messages. She checked the clock on the wall, an actual clock, an old habit from her first office, the one above the dry cleaner where she used to watch the second-hand crawl during meetings that mattered less than this one ever would. At 9:58, the elevator chimed down the hall. At 9:59, Victoria heard footsteps. And at exactly 10, the glass door of the Meridian room opened, and a man stepped inside. He was black, somewhere in his early 50s, with close-cropped gray at his temples, and the kind of build that suggested he still worked out 3 or 4 mornings a week out of discipline rather than vanity. He wore dark trousers and a simple navy jacket, no tie-top button open, and he carried under one arm a worn leather folder, the kind with a strap that wraps around it twice, scuffed pale at the corners from years of use. He didn't look like the man Victoria had built in her head, and in the half-second it took her to register that fact, something in her. Something old, something she would have denied having. If you'd asked her directly, something built out of 1,000 small, unexamined assumptions absorbed over a lifetime made a decision for her before her conscious mind even caught up. He's not the investor. He's someone else. Staff. Deliveries. Wrong floor. She didn't think those words. She didn't need to. The decision arrived pre-verbal in her spine and her shoulders, in the way she straightened and took one step toward the door instead of toward him. "Can I help you?" she said. Not warm. Not the voice she used for people she was trying to impress. The voice she used for problems. The man paused just inside the doorway. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. Calm, unhurried, the way a person speaks when they are used to being clear and have never once needed to raise their voice to be believed. "I'm looking for Victoria Harrington." "I'm Victoria Harrington." She said it the way you'd correct someone's mistake. "This is a closed meeting. It's an investment meeting. We're expecting someone from Carter Legacy Capital." "I know," the man said. This isn't the right room." Victoria cut in, already moving, already reaching for the door to hold it open for him, an exit, not a welcome. "If you're looking for facilities or if you've got a delivery, the front desk on the lobby level can help you. This floor is restricted to scheduled visitors only." Something flickered across the man's face. Not anger. Something quieter, and in its way worse, the specific weary flicker of a man who has watched this exact scene play out enough times in his life that he recognizes its opening lines before they're finished being spoken. "Ms. Harrington," he said, and his voice was still even, still controlled, but there was an edge under it now, thin as a wire. "I have a 10 a.m. appointment. It was scheduled through your CFO's office 3 weeks ago. My name is—" "Sir?" Victoria's voice hardened. Around the table, 3 of her senior team, Daniel included, had gone very still, the particular stillness of people watching something happen that they can see going wrong in real time, but don't yet have the standing to stop. "I don't know who let you up here, but I need you to leave. We have an important meeting starting any minute, and I don't have time to sort out a scheduling mix-up." "This isn't a mix-up. Security." Victoria didn't even turn her head fully. She set it toward the hallway, toward the two building guards who stood near the elevator bank, the way you'd call a dog. "Please escort this gentleman out. He's not on today's visitor list." One of the guards, a heavy-set man named Ortiz, who had worked the Sterling Tower floor for 6 years and had never once had to remove someone from a room with this kind of finality. In a CEO's voice, hesitated for half a second long enough that Victoria noticed and didn't like it. "Now please," she said. Ortiz moved. His hand found the man's upper arm, not rough but firm, the grip of someone doing his job, because his job had just been made very clear to him by the person who signed his contract. "Ms. Harrington." The man's voice rose for the first time, not shouting but sharpened, urgent, the voice of someone trying to get one true sentence out before the door closed. "You need to hear me out before—" "I need you to leave my building," Victoria said. "Now." Daniel Ruiz half rose from his seat at the table. "Victoria." "Sit down, Daniel. This isn't the meeting." The man in the navy jacket didn't fight the guard's grip. He didn't raise his voice further. He let himself be turned toward the door, and in the last second before he was through it, he looked back at Victoria. Not with fury, not with the outrage she might almost have understood better, but with something that looked disturbingly like disappointment. Like a man closing a book he'd already read the ending of, and finding it exactly as sad as he'd expected. "You're going to want to remember this morning," he said quietly. "I hope you do." And then the glass door swung shut behind him, and the sound of it clicking into its frame was for just a moment the loudest sound Victoria Harrington had ever heard in her life, though she wouldn't understand why, for another 2 hours. The room exhaled. Someone laughed nervously, the kind of laugh that fills a silence rather than expressing anything funny. "Well," said Marissa Chen Harrington's head of business development, tapping her pen against her legal pad. "That was strange. You'd think a firm like Carter Legacy would vet their own messengers before sending them up unannounced." "Some people will try anything to get a meeting," said another voice down the table. Tom Halloway, VP of Sales. A man who had never in his life doubted that he belonged wherever he happened to be standing. Probably some consultant trying to weasel his way into the room to pitch us on something. "Happens more than you'd think." Victoria nodded, already moving on, already reorganizing the papers in front of her, because in her mind, the incident was closed, filed, forgotten, a minor housekeeping matter, a security lapse to be addressed later with the front desk. She sat down at the head of the table and folded her hands. "All right," she said. "Now we wait for the actual meeting." Daniel Ruiz was still standing. He hadn't moved since he'd half risen out of his chair. "Daniel," Victoria said, "sit down." "Victoria." His voice had a strange, flattened quality to it, like a man reading bad news off a page he hadn't fully absorbed yet himself. "What did he say his name was?" "He didn't. I didn't ask. It doesn't matter he wasn't on the visitor list. He said Ms. Harrington. He said he had a 10 o'clock appointment scheduled through my office 3 weeks ago." Daniel was already pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket, his fingers moving fast, too fast, the fingers of a man whose stomach has just dropped and hasn't caught up with the rest of him. "Victoria, our 10 a.m. The whole reason we're in this room, our 10 a.m., is Carter Legacy Capital." "I know that, Daniel." That's what I told him. "That's exactly why I had him removed. He wasn't Carter Legacy." "How do you know that?" The question landed strangely. Victoria blinked. "Because—" She stopped. "Because why?" "Because he'd walked in wearing a plain jacket instead of a suit. Because he'd carried a worn folder instead of a leather briefcase with somebody's initials embossed on it. Because he hadn't looked like what she had already decided hours before he ever stepped off that elevator an investor from Carter Legacy Capital was supposed to look like. Because he didn't look like—" She started, and even as the words left her mouth, she heard how they sounded, heard the shape of the sentence she was about to finish, and stopped herself before she said it out loud in front of 11 people. Daniel's phone was already at his ear. "Priya, pull up the confirmation email from Carter Legacy's office, The one with the scheduling details 3 weeks back? I need the contact name on it right now." A pause. His face changed, went pale, then went very still. "Read it to me again." Another pause, longer this time. The room had gone completely silent. Even Tom Halloway, who had never doubted his place at any table, had stopped fidgeting with his pen. "Okay," Daniel said very quietly into the phone. "Okay. Thank you." He lowered the phone. He looked at Victoria the way you look at someone standing at the edge of a cliff who doesn't yet know the ground behind them has already given way. "Victoria," he said. The email was signed by an executive assistant on behalf of the firm's founder and managing principal. The name on that email, the name of the man who was scheduled to walk through that door at 10 o'clock this morning. Daniel, just say it. Is Adrian Carter. The name meant nothing to Victoria for exactly 1.5 seconds, and then it meant everything all at once, like a wave that had been building far out at sea, finally reaching the shore. Adrian Carter, founder of Carter Legacy Capital, the man whose fund had quietly become one of the most respected and most feared by companies who'd once dismissed him, turnaround investment houses in the entire country. A man who had started with nothing, who had built his empire from a background so far removed from Wall Street that the industry press still occasionally ran profiles on him with headlines like "The Outsider Who Cracked the Inside." A man who was, by every account Victoria had ever read, notoriously private, famously difficult to secure a meeting with, and this detail arrived in her memory with the force of a physical blow. A man in his early 50s of medium build, who, according to the one profile photo Victoria had ever actually seen of him years ago in passing in a magazine she'd flipped through in a waiting room, wore his hair cropped close and gray at the temples, and had a habit the article had mentioned almost as a charming footnote, of carrying an old worn leather folder to meetings instead of a briefcase. A folder that had belonged, the article said, to his grandfather who had raised him. Victoria's hand resting on the table went cold. "No," she said. "Victoria, no. That's not Daniel. That man just walked in wearing a plain jacket. No suit, no tie. He didn't look like what?" Daniel's voice cracked. Not with anger exactly, but with something close to it. The sound of a man watching a company he'd given 11 years of his life to take a self-inflicted wound in real time. Like what, Victoria? She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because the honest answer, the one sitting right behind her teeth, the one she would spend the rest of this story trying to outrun, and then eventually trying to face, was a sentence she had never once had to say out loud in her entire adult life. Because she had never once had to examine the picture she carried around in her head of what success, what money, what power was supposed to look like when it walked through a door. He didn't look like what she'd expected. That was the whole sentence. That was the entire damning truth of it. Around the table, nobody spoke. Marissa Chen had gone very pale. Tom Halloway was staring down at his legal pad as if it might offer him somewhere else to look. Priya, standing frozen in the doorway, where she'd just arrived to check on the meeting's start time, had one hand pressed flat against her own mouth. "Get him back," Victoria said. Her voice had lost its earlier hardness. It had gone thin, urgent, almost pleading. "Daniel, call his office. Get him back up here right now. I'll apologize. I'll explain there was a what?" Daniel said quietly. "A mix-up. Victoria, you told the guard to remove him from the building. You called security on Adrian Carter, in front of 11 witnesses. Get him on the phone." Victoria was already reaching for her own cell, her hands not quite steady, fumbling the passcode twice before the screen unlocked. "Now, Daniel, please." Daniel was already dialing, the number pulled from the original confirmation email connected to a professional-sounding voicemail system, a woman's recorded voice stating that she was reaching the office of Adrian Carter and that all calls would be returned in the order received. "This is Daniel Ruiz, CFO of Harrington Technologies," he said into the phone, his voice tight and formal and desperate underneath the formality. "I'm calling regarding this morning's scheduled meeting. There's been a serious misunderstanding, and we need to speak with Mr. Carter as soon as possible. Please call back at your earliest." The message cut off, automated, a full mailbox or a system that simply hadn't been configured to accept anything longer. Victoria tried his office line directly, the number listed on Carter Legacy Capital's public website, the one she pulled up with, shaking fingers, the site loading with agonizing slowness on a conference room Wi-Fi connection that had never felt so cruelly unhurried. A receptionist answered polite, professional, immovable. "I'm sorry, Ms. Harrington. Mr. Carter is unavailable." "I understand he's busy, but this is extremely time-sensitive. If I could just—" "I've noted your call. Someone will follow up if appropriate." If appropriate. The two words landed like a verdict already handed down. Victoria set the phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you'll otherwise throw. The room around her had gone completely silent. 11 people, all of them watching her, all of them understanding with the particular sick clarity that comes over a group of professionals, watching a catastrophe unfold in real time, that they had all just witnessed the collapse of the single best chance Harrington Technologies had left. Not because the numbers hadn't worked, not because the technology hadn't been good enough, or the market hadn't been there, or the timing hadn't been right, because their CEO had looked at a man standing in a doorway and decided in under 2 seconds, based on nothing but the picture already sitting in her head, that he could not possibly be who he said he was. Victoria sat very still at the head of the table she had built her entire career around, commanding. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not know what to say next. Marissa Chen finally broke the silence, her voice small. "Victoria, what do we do?" Victoria didn't answer right away. She was staring at the glass door, the one that had clicked shut behind Adrian Carter 2 minutes ago, though it felt already like it had happened in some other lifetime, on some other morning, to some other version of her that hadn't yet understood what she'd done. "I don't know," she finally said, and the admission cost her more than any of the 41 rejections she'd sat through over the past 4 months combined. "I genuinely don't know." Daniel Ruiz sat back down slowly, his phone still gripped in one hand, as if he might will it to ring through sheer pressure. "Victoria," he said, quiet now. All the earlier sharpness drained out of his voice and replaced with something more like grief. "We had 90 days. We used 90 seconds of it to lose the only real offer we had left." Nobody corrected him. Nobody could. Nobody. Outside the glass walls of the Meridian Room, the city went on exactly as it had 10 minutes before traffic, moving along the river road, the ordinary Tuesday churn of a million people, living lives that had nothing to do with what had just happened in this room. But inside, everything had changed, and every person sitting at that table understood with varying degrees of dread that whatever came next for the company, for their jobs, for the woman sitting at the head of the table, with her hands pressed flat against the polished wood, as if she could somehow hold the morning, still would be shaped entirely by the 5 seconds it had taken Victoria Harrington to look at a stranger in a doorway and decide without a single word of introduction exactly who he could not possibly be. She had built an entire company out of trusting her own instincts, out of moving fast, deciding fast, never second-guessing the read she got on a room, a deal, a person in the first 3 seconds of contact. It was the thing people admired most about her leadership style, the thing that had gotten her onto magazine covers and commencement stages. It was also, she was beginning to understand with a dread that settled into her chest like cold water, the thing that had just quietly, invisibly been broken the entire time. A reflex built not on wisdom, but on assumption, running underneath every one of those fast decisions. Like a fault line nobody had ever bothered to check. She had trusted that instinct completely. And this morning, for the first time, it had cost her everything she had left. She looked around the table at 11 faces that no longer looked at her the way they had an hour ago, not with less respect exactly, but with something more complicated. The particular unsettled look of people who have just watched someone they believed they understood reveal a part of themselves they hadn't known was there. "Someone get legal in here," Victoria said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "And someone find out everything. Everything you can about Adrian Carter. Where he is. What he cares about. What he'd need to hear from me for there to be even the smallest chance he'd give me 5 minutes." "And if there isn't a chance?" Marissa asked quietly. Victoria looked back at the glass door one more time, Then I'll have to live with what I did this morning, she said. But I'm not going to sit here and do nothing while the company burns down around a mistake I made in under a minute. I have to try. She stood up from the head of the table slower than usual, less certain than usual. A woman who had built her whole identity on speed and instinct now facing the first consequence in her career that speed and instinct could not undo. 90 days had just become 89, and somewhere across the city, in an office far removed from the glass and walnut of the Meridian Room, Adrian Carter sat behind his own desk, his worn leather folder set down in front of him unopened, and stared out his window for a long, long moment before he finally picked up his phone, not to call Victoria Harrington back, but to tell his assistant, in a voice that was calm and even and utterly final, to cancel every remaining meeting on his calendar with Harrington Technologies indefinitely. He had spent 6 months studying that company, 6 months believing quietly, almost against his own better judgment, that it might be worth saving. It had taken Victoria Harrington less than 5 minutes to convince him otherwise. By noon, the story had a name inside the walls of Harrington Technologies, though nobody had planned to give it one. People just started calling it the incident, said in that particular hush reserved for things everyone knows about, and nobody wants to be the one explaining out loud. Victoria hadn't left the 41st floor since the meeting ended. She sat in her office with the door half open, which was unusual for her, because normally when she needed to think, she closed the door all the way and let her assistant field the world for a while. But today, she couldn't stand the idea of a closed door. It felt too much like hiding, and hiding felt for the first time in her adult life like something she didn't have the right to do. Daniel Ruiz knocked on the frame anyway out of habit, even though the door was open. Legal's pulled together everything public on Adrian Carter. It's not much. He doesn't do interviews. He doesn't do panels. There's exactly one substantial profile of him, and it's 4 years old. Send it to me. I already did. Victoria. Daniel hesitated in the doorway, the folder in his hands held a little too tightly. I want to say something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just let it bounce off you the way things sometimes do. Victoria looked up. In 11 years, Daniel had never once opened a sentence to her that way. Say it. This isn't only about optics. I know you're already thinking about press exposure, about the video, about what the board's going to say when they hear. I can see it on your face. But that's not the thing that matters most right now. Then what does... You looked at a man and decided who he couldn't be before he said a single sentence to you. Daniel's voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it, something he'd clearly been holding on to since the meeting had ended and hadn't found a place to set down. That's not a scheduling error. That's not bad luck. That's a thing you did. And I think if you spend today only trying to fix the deal and not trying to understand why you did it, you're going to lose both the deal and something else you're not going to be able to buy back with an apology. Victoria sat with that for a long moment. She wanted badly to bristle at it to remind Daniel that she signed his paycheck, that 11 years of loyalty didn't buy him the right to lecture her in her own office. The old reflex rose up fast and familiar, the one that had carried her through 100 boardroom fights and made her very good for a very long time at not backing down from anyone. But she didn't reach for it. Something in her cracked open that morning and still raw at the edges wouldn't let her. I know, she said instead quietly. I know that's true. I just don't know what to do with it yet. Daniel nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Read the profile, he said. Then we'll figure out the rest. The profile was titled The Outsider Who Cracked the Inside, published in a business magazine 4 years earlier, and Victoria read it twice at her desk with her office door still open, and her phone turned face down so she wouldn't be tempted to check it every 90 seconds for a callback that wasn't coming. Adrian Carter had grown up in a neighborhood on the east side of a mid-sized industrial city raised by his grandfather after his mother passed when he was 9. His grandfather had worked 40 years at a manufacturing plant and kept the family together on a foreman's wage and a stubborn, immovable insistence that education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you once you had it. Adrian had gone to a community college first, because that was what was affordable. Then transferred on scholarship to a state university where he studied finance and worked 2 jobs to cover what the scholarship didn't. He had graduated with honors and applied to 11 firms on Wall Street. 9 hadn't responded at all. The 2 that did had interviewed him once each and never called back. He had built his own path instead. Started small, absurdly small. The article said a handful of $1,000 positions in overlooked local businesses that bigger investors wouldn't return calls about. He had a gift apparently for looking past the surface of a struggling company to the thing underneath it that was actually broken, and for telling the difference between a company that was dying and a company that was simply being led badly. Over 2 decades, that gift had compounded into Carter Legacy Capital, a fund that now managed billions specializing exclusively in companies everyone else had already decided to write off. The article quoted him only sparingly. Victoria found herself rereading one passage 3 times. "People assume the hardest part of what I do is finding value nobody else can see," Carter told our reporter. It's not. The hardest part is convincing people to actually listen to you long enough to show them what you found. I've walked into more rooms than I can count where I had to prove I belonged there before anyone would let me say a single word about the numbers. You'd be surprised how much of business is just that. Just getting the chance to speak. Victoria set the tablet down slowly. She thought about the way he had stood in the doorway of the Meridian Room that morning. Calm, steady his voice, never once rising above a controlled, careful register, even as she'd had him physically removed from the building. She thought about the line, "You'd be surprised how much of business is just that. Just getting the chance to speak." She had not given him the chance to speak. She had decided before he opened his mouth to introduce himself properly that he had nothing worth hearing, and the article she now understood with a fresh wave of nausea wasn't describing an isolated incident from Adrian Carter's past. It was describing his entire career. A man who had spent decades fighting exactly the same reflex she'd acted on that morning, not once from one person, but over and over from institution after institution, room after room, until he'd built an empire specifically out of proving those closed doors wrong. And this morning in her boardroom, on the day he had chosen out of everyone he could have chosen to personally walk in and hand her a chance. Most companies in her position never got. She had been one more closed door. She picked the phone back up. Still no calls. No missed messages. Just the small silent screen staring back at her, the emptiness of it feeling less like a technical failure and more like a verdict already handed down. At 2:30, the board chair called. Richard Voss had been chairman of Harrington Technologies board for 6 years, a soft-spoken man in his late 60s, who had in Victoria's experience exactly 2 settings: patient and finished being patient. She had never once in 6 years heard him raise his voice. She had learned the hard way early in her tenure that this was somehow worse than if he had. "Victoria." His voice over speakerphone filled her office with an unhurried, weighted calm. "I got a call from Marissa Chen 40 minutes ago. I want to hear it from you before I hear it from anyone else." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and told him. All of it in order, without softening any part of it. The man in the navy jacket, the folder, the assumption she'd made before he'd finished a single sentence, the guard's hand on his arm, the phone call afterward, that revealed exactly who he was. There was a long silence on the other end of the line when she finished. Long enough that she checked the display to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Richard, I'm here." His voice, when it came back, had lost none of its calm, but something underneath it had shifted, gone colder. "Victoria, I've sat on this board for 6 years. I've watched you make some genuinely brilliant decisions and some genuinely reckless ones, and I've supported you through both kinds because on balance, you're good at this job. But I need you to understand something plainly, because I don't think plain is a language you're used to hearing from me. I'm listening. We had one offer left. One. Not because the technology isn't good, it is, and not because the market isn't there, it might be eventually, if we survive long enough to find it. We had one offer left because every other fund in the country already decided we're too much of a gamble. Adrian Carter was willing to make that gamble anyway. And this morning you looked at the man willing to save 2,000 jobs and you decided based on nothing that he didn't belong in the room he was invited into. I know, Richard. I know exactly what I did. Do you? His voice had an edge now restrained but sharp underneath the restraint. Because I'm not sure you fully understand yet what this looks like from where I'm sitting. This isn't just a lost deal, Victoria. If word of this gets out, and things like this always get out, this becomes a story about who you are, not just what you did. And once that story starts, it doesn't matter how good our fourth quarter numbers might have looked. Nobody invests in a company whose CEO just publicly proved she can't be trusted to treat the people in front of her fairly. Victoria pressed the heel of her hand against her forehead. What do you want me to do? I want you to fix it. I don't care how. Call him, write him show up at his office if you have to, and sit in his lobby until he agrees to see you. But you have 90 days to find new capital, and as of this morning, you've spent one of the very few paths we had left. Find a way to reopen it. And Victoria. Richard paused, and something in the pause felt heavier than anything he'd said yet. This board is not going to protect you from the consequences of this, the way we might have protected you from a bad product launch. This one's different. This one's about character. Fix it, or I don't know how much longer I can keep the rest of the board patient. The call ended. Victoria sat very still in the quiet that followed, staring at the phone on her desk, feeling the full weight of the morning settle into her chest, like something physical, something with mass. Priya found her 20 minutes later standing at the window with her arms crossed, looking down at the river without really seeing it. There's something you need to see, Priya said carefully. I didn't want to bring it to you, but I think you'd rather know than not know. What is it? Priya turned her laptop around. A video 31 seconds long, shaky, clearly filmed on someone's phone from the lobby of the Sterling Tower, catching the tail end of the moment when Adrian Carter was being escorted through the main doors by building security. His expression composed his stride unhurried, even as he was visibly being removed. The caption underneath, added by whoever had posted it, read simply, "Watched a black man get thrown out of a fintech company's HQ this morning." Anybody know what this is about? It had, in the 4 hours since it was posted, been viewed over 200,000 times. Victoria read the caption twice. Then she scrolled against her better judgment through the replies underneath it, hundreds of them already. A cross-current of voices she'd never had to reckon with directly before. Not about herself, not about a decision she'd made with her own hands in under a minute. This happens more than people realize. Just usually there's no video. Give the company the benefit of the doubt we don't know the context yet. Context doesn't matter when you can see it happening in real time. Somebody find out who this guy was. I want to know if he actually did anything wrong, or if this is exactly what it looks like. It's exactly what it looks like. It's always exactly what it looks like. Victoria closed the laptop gently, the way you'd close a door on a room you weren't ready to walk back into yet. Has anyone from press reached out? She asked. Not yet, Priya said. But it's spreading. I don't think it'll stay quiet much longer. Draft nothing, Victoria said. No statement. Not until I've spoken to him directly. If we put out some polished corporate non-apology before I've even talked to the man himself, it'll look exactly like what it would be damage control instead of an actual accounting. Priya nodded, and there was something in her expression, not quite approval, but the beginning of it, the look of someone watching a person she worked for choose for once the harder and more honest path, instead of the easier and more practiced one. I'm going to go see him, Victoria said, mostly to herself. The decision arriving with more certainty than anything else had all day. Not call, not email, I'm going to go to his office and I'm going to wait as long as it takes. He might not see you. I know. Victoria picked up her coat from the back of her chair. But I made him wait outside a room this morning without so much as hearing his name. The least I can do is know what it feels like to wait outside his. Carter Legacy Capital's offices occupied 3 floors of a building on the other side of the river. a building that, unlike the Sterling Tower, with its glass and its polish and its aggressive gleaming modernity, had the understated look of old quiet money brick-restrained signage. A lobby that didn't announce itself. Victoria arrived a little after 4 without an appointment and told the receptionist at the front desk exactly who she was and exactly why she was there without softening any part of it. "I understand Mr. Carter is not expecting me," she said, "and I understand he may not want to see me at all. I'd like to wait if that's permitted, as long as it takes." The receptionist, a young man who clearly had no idea what to do with this particular situation, disappeared into the back for several minutes and returned with an expression that gave nothing away. "You're welcome to wait," he said. "I can't promise he'll come down." "That's fine," Victoria said. "I'll wait anyway." She sat in a low leather chair near the window, her coat still on, her phone silenced and face down in her bag, and she waited. An hour passed. She watched people come and go through the lobby, watched the light outside shift, and lower watched the receptionist glance at her with a mixture of pity and curiosity every 20 minutes or so, as if checking to see whether she'd finally given up and left. She didn't. 2 hours in her phone buzzed once silently against her hip, and she checked it out of habit despite herself. A text from Daniel Boards asking for updates. "What do I tell them?" She typed back. "Tell them I'm still here." 3 hours in the lobby had mostly emptied. The evening security guard had come on shift and eyed her with the particular wariness of a man trained to notice anyone lingering somewhere they weren't obviously supposed to be, and Victoria found herself in a small, strange, unwelcome way, thinking of the guard from that morning, of Ortiz's hand closing around Adrian Carter's arm, of how quickly and completely a person could be reduced in someone else's eyes to a problem requiring removal. She didn't move. At 6:40, an elevator chimed at the far end of the lobby, and Adrian Carter walked out of it. He was wearing a different jacket now, dark gray. His tie loosened his worn leather folder tucked under one arm, exactly as it had been that morning. He stopped near the elevator bank and looked across the lobby at her. Really looked the way you look at something you weren't expecting to find still there. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. Victoria stood up. "Mr. Carter," she said, and her voice, to her own surprise, came out steadier than she felt. "I know you have every reason not to speak to me. I'm not here to ask you for anything about the investment. I came because I owe you an apology I couldn't give you this morning, and because I didn't think it was right to say it over the phone or through an assistant or in some statement my PR team drafted for me. I came to say it to your face the same way I looked at your face this morning and decided, without knowing anything about you, that you didn't belong in my building." Adrian studied her for a long moment. He didn't come closer. He didn't sit down. He simply stood there, the width of the lobby between them, his expression unreadable in a way that felt to Victoria more unsettling than open anger would have been. "You've been sitting here for 3 hours, he said finally. It wasn't a question. "I have." "Why?" "Because you waited to be let into a room this morning, and I had you thrown out of it before you finished a sentence. I thought the least I owed you was understanding what waiting actually feels like." Something shifted very slightly in Adrian's expression, not softening exactly, but a kind of recalibration, as if he was updating a picture in his own head, the way she had that morning updated nothing at all. "Walk with me," he said finally, gesturing toward a small seating area near the far windows, away from the receptionist's desk and the security guard's watchful eye. "You've earned 5 minutes. I want to be honest with you, I don't know yet if you'll earn a 6th. They sat across from each other in low chairs near the window, the city lights beginning to come up outside as the evening settled in. Adrian set his folder down on the low table between them, unopened, and folded his hands. "Tell me what you think happened this morning," he said. "Not what you think you should say. What actually happened in your own head in the moment you decided to have me removed." Victoria took a breath. She understood the actual test, not the apology itself, which anyone could rehearse, but whether she could describe honestly the thing that had happened inside her before she'd even had a chance to think about it. I saw a man in a plain jacket carrying a folder instead of a briefcase, and some part of me decided before you said a single word that you couldn't be who you said you were," she said slowly. "I want to tell you it was about the folder or the jacket or something reasonable and defensible like that. But that's not honest. The truth is, I'd already built a picture in my head of what an investor from a firm like yours was supposed to look like, and you didn't match it, and I let that picture make the decision instead of letting you speak." "And what did that picture look like?" Victoria hesitated. "Say it." Adrian said, not unkindly but firmly. "You've come this far. Don't stop now." "Older? White, probably. A suit? Someone who looked like every other person who's ever sat across a table from me in a meeting like that." Her voice caught slightly. "I've spent 20 years being underestimated myself in different ways as a woman running a technology company in a world of men who assumed I couldn't be as sharp as I was until I proved it to them meeting after meeting. And somehow that never once stopped me from carrying around a picture of my own of who belongs in the room and who doesn't. I built my whole company by refusing to let anyone else's assumptions define me. And this morning, I did the exact same thing to you that I've spent my whole career being angry at other people for doing to me." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his eyes steady on her face, unreadable. "You know what the worst part of this morning was for me," he said finally. "It wasn't being removed. It wasn't the guard's hand on my arm, or the way your team all just sat there and let it happen. I've had worse than that happen to me, Ms. Harrington, more times than I'd care to count at other companies in other rooms over 30 years of doing this work. I've had my own driver mistaken for the principal at a meeting because a receptionist assumed the man with the nicer suit had to be in charge. I've had security called on me twice before this morning, twice in boardrooms where I was the person writing the check." Victoria felt something twist in her chest. "The worst part," Adrian continued, "was that I genuinely believed walking in this morning that this time might be different. I'd spent 6 months studying your technology. I read every filing, every patent application, every piece of code documentation your team was willing to share. I built a model of what your company could become if it had the right partner and enough runway to actually execute on what you'd built, instead of chasing quarterly numbers to satisfy investors who never believed in you in the first place. I don't do that work for companies I don't think are worth saving. And I walked in this morning hoping, which is not something I let myself do very often anymore, that the woman who built that technology might be different from the rooms I usually walk into." "I wasn't," Victoria said quietly. "I was exactly the room you usually walk into." "Yes," Adrian said. "You were." The silence that followed sat heavy between them. Outside, the last of the daylight had faded entirely, and the lobby's overhead lights had brightened to compensate, throwing long shadows across the floor. "I'm not here to ask for the deal back," Victoria said finally. "I want to be clear about that. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything right now. I came because you deserve to hear from me directly that I understand what I did, and that I'm not going to pretend it was a scheduling error or a security mix-up to anyone, not the board, not the press, not my own team. I did that. Nobody else." Adrian studied her for a long moment. "Do you know why I chose Harrington Technologies?" he asked. "Out of every struggling company that crosses my desk, and there are dozens every month, all of them hoping I'll be the one who finally says yes. Do you know what made me choose yours?" Victoria shook her head. "Because the technology was genuinely good, and because everyone else had already given up on it for reasons that had nothing to do with whether it worked," Adrian said. "That's the pattern of my entire career, Ms. Harrington. I don't look for perfect companies. I look for good ideas that got buried under bad assumptions, assumptions that had nothing to do with whether the idea was sound. Your product failed in the market, not because the technology was flawed, but because it was rushed, mismanaged, launched before it was ready by people under pressure to hit a number. That's fixable. That's exactly the kind of problem I know how to fix." He paused. "What I didn't expect," he continued, was to watch in real time the same pattern that killed your product play out in how you treated the person standing in your doorway. You didn't look at me and see a problem you could fix. You looked at me and saw a problem to remove. And I have to ask myself now honestly whether that's just who you are underneath the pitch deck, someone who solves problems by getting rid of the parts that don't fit the picture in your head, instead of actually understanding them first. Victoria felt the words land, and she didn't flinch away from them, though every instinct in her wanted to. "I don't know the answer to that yet," she said. "I want to tell you it isn't true, but I don't think I've earned the right to tell you that, and have you believe me. I think the only way I could ever actually answer that question is by proving it over time, in a way you could see for yourself. Not tonight. Not with anything I say in this lobby." Adrian was quiet again longer this time. He looked down at the worn leather folder on the table between them. His grandfather's folder. The one he'd carried into rooms for 30 years. Into rooms that had doubted him, dismissed him, occasionally thrown him out entirely. And this morning one more room had done exactly the same thing. Except this time, the room had belonged to a woman who claimed to understand what it felt like to be underestimated. "I told my assistant this afternoon to cancel every remaining meeting on our calendar with your company," he said finally. "I want you to know that. I hadn't planned on giving Harrington Technologies another opportunity. As far as I was concerned this morning, the deal was dead the moment that guard's hand closed around my arm." Victoria's stomach dropped, though she'd half expected exactly this. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'm not finished," Adrian said. "I'm telling you that because I want you to understand exactly how unlikely what I'm about to say actually is. You showed up here. You sat in that lobby for 3 hours without knowing whether I'd even come down. You didn't send an assistant. You didn't send a statement. You told the truth about what happened in your own head this morning, instead of dressing it up in language that would have made it easier for you to live with." He leaned forward slightly. "That doesn't erase what happened. I want to be very clear about that. It doesn't undo the fact that 11 people watched you have me removed from a room I had every right to be in. But it's the first thing that's happened today that makes me willing to consider, just consider, that there might be more than one version of who you are." "What does that mean?" Victoria asked, not quite daring to hope. "It means I'm not saying yes," Adrian said. "And I'm not saying no. It means I'm willing to talk again, not tomorrow, not this week. I need time to decide whether what I saw in that lobby just now is a real thing or a very well-executed performance by a woman desperate enough to do whatever it takes to save her company." His eyes stayed steady on hers. "You have 90 days, minus whatever you've already burned since this morning. I'd suggest you spend the time between now and whenever I call you back, thinking hard about which one of those two things is actually true. Because if I do decide to sit across a table from you again, I'll know the difference. I've had 30 years of practice telling them apart." He stood gathering his folder, and for a moment Victoria thought that was the end of it, that he would simply walk away, back toward the elevators, and she would be left sitting in the darkened lobby with nothing but the memory of having tried. But he paused halfway toward the elevator bank and looked back at her one more time. "For what it's worth," he said, "most people who do what you did this morning never sit in a lobby for 3 hours afterward. They send flowers. They send lawyers. They send someone else to clean it up so they don't have to feel what it costs." His expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it shifted some small and grudging allowance. "You didn't do that, I noticed." And then he was gone. The elevator doors closing behind him, and Victoria Harrington sat alone in the darkened lobby of Carter Legacy Capital, her coat still buttoned, her phone still silent in her bag, feeling for the first time all day something that wasn't quite hope and wasn't quite despair, but sat somewhere uneasily between the two, the feeling of a door that hadn't closed all the way, even if it hadn't opened either. She didn't know yet whether that would be enough. She only knew that for the first time since the guard's hand had closed around Adrian Carter's arm that morning, she had done something that felt less like damage control and more like the truth. And whatever came next, She understood walking back out into the cool evening air toward her car would depend entirely on whether that truth turned out to be enough to outweigh the 5 seconds that had started all of this. 5 seconds, she would spend the rest of this story, and likely far longer than that, trying to understand and trying in whatever way was still left to her to repair. The days that followed didn't feel like days so much as a slow grinding count, each one arriving with its own fresh version of the same dread. Victoria woke every morning to her phone already lit up with notifications she didn't want to read, and she made herself read them anyway because Daniel had told her once years ago that the worst thing a leader could do in a crisis was pretend the crisis wasn't happening, and for once in her life she was trying badly and imperfectly to actually take that advice. The video had not stayed contained. By Thursday, it had crossed a threshold from a local curiosity shared among people who recognized the Sterling Tower lobby into something bigger picked up by 2 mid-sized business news accounts. And then, by Friday morning, by a national outlet with a headline that made Victoria's stomach drop the moment she read it on her phone, before she'd even gotten out of bed. Tech CEO has black man removed from investment meeting. Turns out he was the investor. She read the article twice, lying flat on her back in the gray early light, feeling something like vertigo. It was accurate. That was almost the worst part. There was nothing to dispute, nothing to correct, no factual error to seize on and use to discredit the story or buy herself room to maneuver. It had happened exactly the way the article described it, because she had made it happen exactly that way. And now the entire country, or some meaningful slice of it anyway, was going to know her name attached to that headline before they ever knew anything else about her. Her phone rang while she was still staring at the ceiling. Daniel. "Have you seen it?" he said. Not a question. "I'm looking at it right now." Richards called an emergency board session for this afternoon. 4 o'clock. He wants you there in person, not on the phone. Victoria closed her eyes. "Is this the meeting where they ask me to step down?" "I don't know," Danielle said, and his honesty, however unwelcome, was at least something she could trust. "I think it might be close to that. I think you need to walk in there today with something more than an apology, Victoria. You need a plan. Something real, not a press release. I don't have a deal to offer them. Carter Legacy hasn't called back. Then you need something else. Something that shows the board this isn't going to become a pattern, that whatever happened Tuesday morning, it's not who this company is going to be from here forward. Because right now, all they have is a viral video and a CEO who hasn't given them anything to hold on to except a promise that she's sorry. Victoria sat up slowly, the weight of the morning settling into her shoulders like something physical. "Give me the day," she said. "I'll have something by 4. She spent the morning in her office with the door closed for the first time all week, working through a single question over and over, turning it in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down. What would it actually mean to prove, not just say that Tuesday morning wasn't who she was, or worse, what would it mean to prove that it was, and to change that fact instead of merely apologizing for it? She thought about something Adrian had said to her in that darkened lobby 3 nights ago. "You didn't look at me and see a problem you could fix. You looked at me and saw a problem to remove." The sentence had lodged somewhere behind her ribs and hadn't left since returning to her at odd hours in the shower, in the elevator, in the half-second before sleep took her at night. She picked up her office phone and called down to HR. "I need every exit interview conducted at this company in the last 3 years." She told the department head, a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had worked at Harrington Technologies for 9 years, and had Victoria realized with a small pang of shame, never once been invited into a strategy conversation at this level before. "I need to know who left and why, and whether any patterns show up that I should have seen and didn't." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "All of them." That's Victoria. That's dozens of files. Some of that touches on some sensitive complaints we handled internally. "I know. I want to see it anyway. All of it." "Can I ask why?" Victoria looked out her window at the river at the ordinary Friday traffic, Moving along the road below, people driving to jobs and appointments and lives that had nothing to do with the reckoning currently taking place in her chest. Because I think I've been running this company the same way I walked into that boardroom Tuesday morning, she said slowly. Deciding fast, trusting my gut, never looking twice at the people I decided didn't fit the picture. And I think if that's true about how I handled one investor in one meeting, it's probably true about a lot more than that meeting. I need to actually know Carol, not guess, know. Another pause longer this time, and when Carol spoke again, her voice had changed, not warmer exactly, but more present, like someone recalibrating what kind of conversation this was actually going to be. "I'll have it to you by 2, she said. There's more there than you probably think there is, Victoria. I tried to flag some of it 18 months ago, and it didn't really go anywhere." Victoria felt something cold settle in her stomach. "Send it anyway." The files arrived at 1:50, a compressed folder, heavier than she'd expected, and Victoria spent the next 2 hours reading through them with a mounting, sickening recognition that had nothing to do with legal exposure and everything to do with a pattern she had simply never bothered to look for. A senior engineer, one of the company's earliest hires, who had left 18 months ago, citing being repeatedly passed over for a technical leadership role in favor of newer hires who fit the culture better. A phrase Victoria now understood. Reading it cold on a page that had almost certainly meant nothing, except that they looked and sounded more like the picture already sitting in someone's head of what leadership was supposed to look like. A product manager. A woman who had built one of the company's most successful early features, whose exit interview noted in flat HR language that she'd felt consistently unheard in strategy meetings despite repeated contributions, and who had left for a competitor 8 months ago where Victoria checked her stomach tightening further. She now ran an entire division. 3 more, then 5 more. Then Victoria stopped counting individual names and started seeing instead the shape of the thing itself. A company that had built a culture without ever deciding to where certain people had to work twice as hard to be seen at all, and where the people making the decisions about who got heard, who got promoted, who got trusted with the next big opportunity, had never once had to examine the picture in their own heads of who deserved those things. She had built that company, not on purpose, but she had built it the same way she had built the picture in her head of what an investor from Carter Legacy Capital was supposed to look like, not through any single deliberate decision, but through 1,000 small, unexamined ones, compounding silently over years until the pattern was so deeply embedded in how the company operated that nobody, including her, had thought to call it a pattern at all. She sat back in her chair, the folder open on her desk, and for the first time since Tuesday morning, she didn't feel defensive. She felt something closer to grief, the particular specific grief of understanding that a mistake you thought was small and contained was actually just the visible tip of something much larger you'd been building for years without ever looking at it directly. At 3:15, she called Daniel into her office and showed him the folder. He read through it in silence, his expression darkening page by page, until finally he set it down on her desk and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "You didn't know any of this?" he asked. "No," Victoria said. "And that's not an excuse, Daniel. That's the actual problem. I built a company where I could not know this for 18 months, where Carol tried to flag it, and it went nowhere, where good people left one after another, and I never once asked myself why, because the company kept growing and the numbers kept looking fine on paper, and I never had to look any deeper than that." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to walk into that board meeting in 45 minutes, Victoria said, "and instead of giving them a polished apology about one incident on Tuesday morning, I'm going to tell them the truth about what that incident actually revealed. And then I'm going to tell them what I'm going to do about it, not as a PR strategy, but because if I don't fix this, it's going to keep happening whether or not Adrian Carter ever calls me back." Dead. The boardroom at 4 o'clock felt colder than usual, though nothing about the room itself had changed. The same long table, the same view of the river, the same watercolor light coming in through the windows. What had changed was the air in it. The particular charged stillness of 8 board members, who had all in their own ways spent the last 3 days fielding calls from reporters, from investors, from people in their own social circles, asking pointed questions about the company whose board they sat on. Richard Voss sat at the head of the table. This time not Victoria, a small deliberate signal that hadn't gone unnoticed by anyone in the room, least of all Victoria herself. "We'll get to the incident itself," Richard said once everyone had settled. "But first, I want an honest accounting, Victoria, of where things stand with Carter Legacy Capital. Has there been any further contact?" "No," Victoria said. "I went to his office Tuesday evening. I apologized directly in person, and I was honest with him about what happened in my own head in that meeting, rather than trying to explain it away. He told me he wasn't saying yes, and he wasn't saying no. He said he needed time to decide whether what he saw from me was real or a performance. I haven't heard from him since, and I don't know when or if I will." A murmur moved around the table. Not surprise exactly, but the particular discomfort of hearing uncertainty stated plainly, instead of dressed up in the kind of hopeful, hedging language executives usually reached for in moments like this. "So we have no deal," said one of the board members. A sharp-eyed woman named Elaine Foster, who ran her own consulting firm and had in 6 years never once let Victoria get away with an evasive answer. "We have a viral video, a board reputation taking damage by the hour, and a CEO who's already burned the one investor willing to take a chance on us. Victoria, I need to understand what you're bringing us today, besides an apology, because an apology doesn't buy us runway." "I'm not here to apologize today," Victoria said. "I did that already to the person who actually deserved to hear it, and I'll keep doing it as many times as it takes. What I'm here to tell you is what I found when I started looking harder at Tuesday morning instead of trying to make it go away." She opened the folder in front of her, the same one Carol had sent the same exit interviews, the same pattern laid bare across 18 months of quiet departures nobody had ever properly examined. "I asked HR this morning for every exit interview conducted at this company over the last 3 years, Victoria said. "I wanted to know if what happened Tuesday was an isolated moment or something deeper that Tuesday just happened to make visible to everyone at once in a way I couldn't make excuses for anymore." She slid copies across the table. "It's the second one. I built a company, not intentionally, not with any single decision I can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. But I built a company where the people making decisions about who gets heard, who gets promoted, who gets trusted with opportunity, have been operating off assumptions nobody ever examined, including me, especially me." The room had gone very quiet. Richard Voss was reading through the pages slowly, his expression unreadable. 18 months ago, Victoria continued, one of our most talented engineers left this company because he was repeatedly passed over for a role he was more qualified for than the person who got it. HR flagged it. I never saw it because I never asked to see it because on paper the numbers still looked fine and I decided that was enough. It wasn't the only one. There are 11 files in that folder, Richard. 11 people who tried in one way or another to tell this company something was broken, and the company, meaning me, meaning the culture I built, and never once stopped to examine, didn't listen. Elaine Foster looked up from the pages in front of her, and for the first time since the meeting had started, her expression had shifted from sharp skepticism into something more complicated. "Why are you telling us this now? You could have kept this contained. Nobody outside this room would have needed to know about 11 exit interviews from 3 years ago. You've just handed the board a document that makes the legal exposure here significantly worse. Because pretending it isn't true doesn't make it not true," Victoria said. "It just means the next time it happens somewhere I can't see it coming to someone I'll never even hear about. And this board will find out about it the same way we found out about Tuesday from a video online after the damage is already done. I would rather you know everything now while there's still a chance to actually fix it than protect this company's image for another 18 months, while the same pattern keeps quietly pushing good people out the door." Richard set the folder down and looked at her for a long moment, his expression harder to read than she'd expected. "What do you propose we do with this?" he said. Not quite a question, More like a challenge. A full external review, Victoria said. Not internal HR and outside firm with no stake in protecting this company's reputation, given full access to everything reporting directly to the board. Not to me. I want every promotion decision from the last 3 years examined. I want every complaint that was ever quietly closed, reopened, and looked at honestly. And I want the findings made public, not buried, because if this company is going to survive the next 90 days, it's not going to survive them by looking like it's hiding something. It's going to survive them by proving in a way people can actually verify that whatever happened Tuesday morning and whatever's in that folder isn't going to keep happening. That's an enormous risk, said another board member, a quieter man named Wilkes who rarely spoke first in these meetings. A public review could turn up things far worse than what's already in the press. You'd be handing critics a second story and a third potentially for months. Maybe, Victoria said. Or maybe it's the only thing that actually rebuilds any trust at all, not just with investors, but with the employees who are watching every single one of us right now to see if this is a real reckoning or just another press cycle we're trying to survive. The room fell silent again. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Victoria with an expression she couldn't quite place. Not approval exactly, but something that had at minimum stopped being pure exasperation. 6 years I've watched you run this company, he said finally. And in 6 years, I've never once heard you propose something that made your own position more vulnerable instead of less. I want to understand why now. Victoria thought about the lobby 3 nights ago, about Adrian Carter setting his grandfather's worn folder down on the low table between them and asking her with a directness nobody had used with her in years, whether the woman sitting across from him was real or a performance. Because someone asked me a question this week I couldn't answer honestly without changing how I do things, she said. Adrian Carter told me he's spent 30 years proving rooms wrong about who belongs in them, and Tuesday morning I was one more room. I don't know if he'll ever give this company another chance. I have to live with the very real possibility that I already lost that opportunity permanently through my own actions, and there's nothing I can do to undo the 5 seconds that caused it. But I can decide what kind of company this becomes from here, whether or not he ever calls back. That has to matter on its own, separate from whether it saves the deal. If it only matters because it might save the deal, then it isn't really a change at all. It's just one more performance, and I think everyone in this room and everyone watching that video online would see through it eventually anyway. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Outside, the light had begun to shift toward evening, the river below catching the last gold of the afternoon. I'll need to bring this to a formal vote, Richard said finally. The external review, the public findings, all of it. I can't promise you the board will approve it as you've described it. Some of them are going to want something smaller, more controlled. I understand, Victoria said, but I'd rather fight for the version that's actually honest than accept a version that's just easier to survive. Richard nodded slowly, and for just a moment, something in his expression softened not into approval, not yet, but into something that looked for the first time in this entire meeting, like the beginning of it. We'll vote Monday, he said. In the meantime, Victoria, I want you to understand that this doesn't undo Tuesday. It doesn't undo the video or the 11 names in that folder, or however many more names might surface once an outside firm starts actually looking. What you've done today is the beginning of taking this seriously. It is not on its own redemption. I need you to hold both of those truths at once, because I think you're the kind of person who might be tempted to believe that doing the hard thing today erases what happened 3 days ago. It doesn't. It just means you're finally paying attention to what 3 days ago actually revealed. I understand, Victoria said quietly. I'm not looking for it to erase anything. I don't think it can. The board approved the review the following Monday. 7 votes to 1, with only Wilkes voting against it, citing continued concerns about legal exposure. The announcement went out that afternoon, not as a polished press release drafted by the communications team, though they'd drafted several versions. Each one Victoria had sent back with the same note: too careful, too protected, doesn't sound like a person actually taking responsibility. The version that finally went out was shorter than any of the drafts and plainer, And it named the incident directly, instead of gesturing around it with careful corporate language. And it committed publicly to releasing whatever the external review found, however uncomfortable that might turn out to be. The reaction in the days that followed was not universally kind. Some outlets covered it skeptically, framing it as a calculated reputational maneuver by a CEO with nothing left to lose. Some of Victoria's own peers in the industry, people she'd known for years, called to offer support that felt underneath the warmth more like concern for what her transparency might mean for all of them. For the unspoken understanding among executives that certain things were better handled quietly. But something else happened too. Something Victoria hadn't fully anticipated. Employees began slowly and cautiously at first to come forward, not through the anonymous portal the external review firm had set up. Though many did use that too, but directly in person, stopping by her office or catching her in the hallway, telling her things she had never known about her own company, about moments large and small, where they had felt exactly what Adrian Carter had described in that darkened lobby, the specific, exhausting weight of having to prove you belonged in a room before anyone would let you speak in it. A young engineer named Marcus Webb, who had been at the company barely a year, stopped by her office on a Wednesday afternoon, visibly nervous, holding a laptop against his chest, like a shield. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "But I saw the announcement, and I figured if you're actually serious about this, you should hear it from someone still here, not just the people who already left." "I want to hear it," Victoria said, and meant it in a way that surprised her with its own intensity. Marcus told her about a product meeting 8 months earlier, where he'd proposed a solution to a persistent bug that had been slowing down the platform's core search function. A solution that had been dismissed in the room, waved off by a senior manager without much discussion, only to be rediscovered 3 weeks later by a different engineer who received full credit for the fix, a bonus and a mention in the company's internal newsletter. "I'm not telling you this because I want anything out of it," Marcus said. "I actually like working here most days. I'm telling you because I watched that video like everyone else, and I thought maybe if enough of us actually say something now, this turns into something real, instead of just another headline that fades in a month." Victoria wrote his name down, and the date, and the details, and told him she'd make sure it was part of what the external review looked at, not swept aside, not smoothed over, but actually examined with consequences attached if the account held up. It was the fourth conversation like that in a week. It would not be the last. 2 weeks into the review, Victoria's phone rang on a Thursday evening while she was still at her desk, well past when most of the floor had emptied out. She almost didn't recognize the number, and when she answered, the voice on the other end took a moment to place. "Ms. Harrington." Adrian Carter's voice, calm and even as she remembered it, though something in it had shifted slightly. Not warmer exactly, but less guarded than it had been in that lobby 3 weeks earlier. Victoria's chest tightened. "Mr. Carter, I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I know," he said. "I've been watching the news same as everyone else. The board vote. The announcement. I've had someone on my team quietly following the progress of your external review, which I understand is turning up more than the board initially expected." "It is," Victoria admitted. "More than I expected too, if I'm honest. It's not comfortable. Some days it's the hardest thing I've ever had to sit through." "Good," Adrian said, and there was something almost approving in the single word. "If it were comfortable, I'd have real doubts about whether it was actually accomplishing anything." There was a pause on the line, and Victoria found herself holding her breath, unsure what came next, unwilling to fill the silence with anything that might sound like she was pushing. "I told you 3 weeks ago that I needed time to decide whether what I saw in that lobby was real," Adrian said finally. "I want to be honest with you, I still don't fully know the answer to that. 3 weeks isn't very long, and people are capable of performing sincerity for far longer than that when the stakes are high enough." "I understand," Victoria said quietly. "But I've watched you do something in these 3 weeks that surprised me," he continued. "You didn't just apologize and move on the moment the news cycle allowed you to. You went looking for the parts of your own company you didn't want to find, and when you found them, you didn't bury them. That's not nothing, Ms. Harrington. Most people, given the choice between a hard truth and a manageable lie, choose the manageable lie every single time, especially when they're fighting for their company's survival, and every incentive points toward making the story go away as quietly and quickly as possible. Victoria closed her eyes, something in her chest loosening slightly for the first time in weeks. "So what does that mean?" "It means I'm willing to sit across a table from you again," Adrian said. "Not the same terms as before. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not simply picking up where we left off 3 weeks ago, as though nothing happened. If we do this, it comes with conditions I didn't have on the table the first time, conditions about how this company operates going forward, not just about the numbers." "I'll hear whatever conditions you have," Victoria said. "I mean that, whatever they are." "I know you will," Adrian said. "That's part of why I'm calling." Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened just slightly into something that sounded for the first time since she'd met him, almost like the beginning of trust. "My office next Tuesday, 10 a.m. And Ms. Harrington this time. I'd like you to bring the folder, the one with the 11 names in it. I want to see exactly what you found, and exactly what you're planning to do about every single one of them before we talk about anything else." "I'll be there," Victoria said. "And Mr. Carter, thank you for calling, for giving me even this much." "Don't thank me yet," Adrian said, and there was something almost like warmth underneath the caution in his voice now, the first real crack in the composed, guarded distance he'd kept between them since that morning in the Meridian room. "This isn't a yes, it's a conversation. Whether it becomes anything more than that depends entirely on what you bring into that room next Tuesday and how honest you're willing to be about all of it, not just the parts that are easy to say out loud." The call ended, and Victoria sat alone in her darkened office, the city lights coming up outside her window. The folder with 11 names still open on her desk where she'd left it, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she let herself feel something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite hope, but sat cautiously somewhere close to both the fragile, unfamiliar feeling of a door that had been closed for good, and had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, opened again, if only by a crack. If only for now. If only because she had finally been willing to look directly at the thing she'd spent her whole career refusing to see. She had one more chance. She understood, sitting there in the quiet of her office with the folder open in front of her, that it would not be enough to simply want it badly enough. It would have to be earned in a room under conditions she didn't yet know from a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how to tell the difference between a person who had changed and a person who had only learned to say the right things. Tuesday was 5 days away. She intended to spend every one of them making sure that when she walked back through Adrian Carter's door, there would be nothing left in her to perform only the truth, however hard it turned out to be laid out plainly on the table between them. Victoria didn't sleep well the night before Tuesday. She lay awake past midnight, going over what she would say, then made herself stop, because she understood somewhere underneath the anxiety that rehearsing an honest conversation was itself a kind of performance. And performance was exactly what Adrian Carter had told her he was watching for. She arrived at Carter Legacy Capital 10 minutes early, the folder with the 11 names tucked under her arm, and this time the receptionist recognized her on sight and simply said, "He's expecting you. Go on up." The office Adrian led her into was smaller than she'd imagined, given the size of the fund he ran. No dramatic skyline view. No wall of framed accolades. Just a modest room with a solid wooden desk, 2 chairs facing it, and a single shelf lined with worn books that looked read rather than displayed. His grandfather's folder sat on the corner of the desk, closed the way it had been in the lobby 3 weeks earlier. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, and Victoria did, setting her own folder down on the desk between them without being asked. Adrian didn't reach for it immediately. He studied her for a long moment, instead, the way he had that first morning, before she'd ever opened her mouth. Except this time, she understood she was being read for something entirely different. "Before we get into any of that," he said, nodding toward her folder, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually think before you answer, not just say the thing you assume I want to hear. Okay? Why do you want this deal?" Victoria blinked. "Because my company is 90 days from collapse, and you're the only serious offer we have left." "That's not what I asked." Adrian's voice stayed even, but there was a directness in it now that hadn't been there in the lobby, a sharper edge like a man testing the weight of a bridge before he'd let himself walk across it. I asked why you want it, not why you need it. Anyone can need money. I need to understand whether you actually want to become the kind of leader who deserves it, or whether you just want the 90 days to turn back into more 90 days over and over, until eventually you're standing in another room making the same decision you made 3 weeks ago to someone else. Victoria sat with that question longer than she'd expected to. The old instinct in her wanted to answer fast confidently, the way she answered everything. But she made herself slow down instead. The way she'd been forcing herself to slow down for 3 weeks now. Ever since the folder full of exit interviews had shown her exactly what speed and instinct left unexamined could quietly build. I want it because I don't think I actually understood until 3 weeks ago what kind of company I'd built, she said finally. I thought I was running a company that valued good ideas and hard work. What I found when I finally looked was a company that valued those things only from the people who already looked and sounded like what I expected success to look like. I want this deal because I want the chance to actually fix that, not perform fixing it for a news cycle, and then quietly let it slide once the story dies down. But if you're asking whether I want it because I've become a fundamentally different person in 3 weeks, I don't think that's true either, and I don't think you'd believe me if I said it was. I think what's true is that I finally started paying attention to something I'd spent my whole career refusing to look at, and I don't know yet how far that attention will take me. I just know I don't intend to stop. Adrian was quiet for a moment, his expression unreadable, and then he reached across the desk and pulled the folder toward him, opening it slowly, scanning the 11 names inside. Walk me through them, he said. Not the summary HR wrote, what you actually did about each one. Victoria took a breath and began. It took the better part of an hour. She went through each name in the folder in order the engineer passed over for the leadership role he'd earned, now offered a formal reinstatement conversation, and a public acknowledgement of what had happened, which he had cautiously accepted. The product manager who'd left for a competitor 8 months earlier, whom Victoria had personally called not to recruit her back. She'd been clear about that on the call, but simply to apologize and ask what the company could have done differently. A conversation that had lasted 90 minutes and left Victoria rattled by how much specific granular detail the woman remembered about being overlooked, meeting after meeting for over a year, before she'd finally given up and left. She told him about Marcus Webb, the young engineer whose fix had been quietly credited to someone else, and how the external review firm had confirmed his account through internal commit logs and meeting notes, and how the senior manager involved had been placed on a formal review with the board directly overseeing the outcome, not buried in a routine HR process, where it might quietly disappear. Adrian listened without interrupting, occasionally making a small note in the margin of his own copy, his expression giving away nothing until she finished. 11 cases, he said finally. How many more do you think are actually out there that this review hasn't surfaced yet? I don't know, Victoria admitted. The review firm told me 2 weeks ago that patterns like this rarely stop at the number you first find. I've made peace with the fact that this number is probably going to grow before it shrinks. Has that scared off the board? Almost. Victoria allowed herself something close to a rueful smile. Elaine Foster nearly walked out of a meeting 2 weeks ago when the review turned up a 12th case mid-session. But she stayed. She's actually become one of the strongest voices pushing for us to keep going, even when it gets uncomfortable more than I expected, honestly. Adrian nodded slowly, closing the folder. And for a moment, he said nothing. Looking instead at his grandfather's worn leather folder sitting on the corner of the desk, his fingers resting lightly against its edge. My grandfather used to say something to me when I was young, he said finally. His voice quieter now, less like an interrogation, and more like something he was choosing deliberately to share. He said the easiest thing in the world is to be sorry after you've been caught. The hardest thing in the world is staying sorry after everyone stops watching. Most people manage the first one. Almost nobody manages the second. Which one do you think I'm doing? Victoria asked. I don't know yet, Adrian said honestly. That's the truth. I've watched 3 weeks of a very public, very costly process that you didn't have to start, and that's made your board's job harder, your legal exposure worse, and your press coverage more complicated than it would have been if you just quietly apologized and moved on the way most executives in your position would have done. That tells me something. It doesn't tell me everything. He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. So here's what I'm prepared to offer, and I want you to understand, it isn't the same offer I walked into your boardroom with 3 weeks ago. Victoria straightened slightly, bracing herself. $400 million, Adrian said. Same number as before, but not all at once, and not without conditions attached to how it's released. He slid a single typed page across the desk toward her. First tranche releases immediately enough to stabilize operations and buy you real runway beyond the 90 days. The remaining amount releases in phases over 18 months, tied directly to independently verified progress, not on revenue targets, though obviously those matter too, but on the specific commitments in that document. Full completion of the external review with findings made permanently public, not just for this news cycle. A restructured promotion and hiring process designed with input from an outside firm I trust, reviewed quarterly by an independent committee that includes at least 2 people from outside this company entirely. And a seat on your board, mine personally, not a désigné for the full 18 months, with real oversight authority, not a ceremonial position. Victoria scanned the page quickly, her mind already working through what each condition would mean, what it would cost her in autonomy, in control, in the kind of unchecked authority she'd wielded without ever fully realizing it for over a decade. You'd have real veto power on promotions, she said slowly, reading further down the page. On senior leadership promotions specifically, yes, Adrian said. For 18 months. I want to be direct with you about why. It's not because I don't trust your intentions right now sitting in this room today. It's because I've watched good intentions erode under pressure more times than I can count a bad quarter aboard, demanding faster growth. And suddenly, the careful, uncomfortable work of actually examining who gets promoted and why becomes the first thing that gets quietly deprioritized, because it's slower and harder than just going with your gut the way you always have. I'm not offering you a partnership built on trusting that won't happen. I'm offering you a partnership built on making sure it can't happen unchecked, even if it tries to. Victoria set the page down and looked at him for a long moment. That's a significant loss of control for me. It is. Adrian agreed without apology. That's the point. You've told me yourself that the thing that got you into this room in the first place was an unexamined instinct you'd trusted without question for your entire career. I'm not interested in giving $400 million to a company still run entirely on that same unchecked instinct, however, sincerely apologetic the person holding it might currently feel. If you want my investment, it comes with someone in the room whose entire job for the next 18 months is making sure the instinct gets examined every single time before it becomes a decision. Victoria felt something complicated move through her, not quite resistance, though a part of her. The old part. The part that had built an empire on being the smartest person in every room, and answering to no one, bristled instinctively at the idea of ceding that much authority to anyone, let alone a man she'd met under the worst possible circumstances 3 weeks earlier. Weeks. But underneath that old instinct, something else had been growing these last 3 weeks. Something quieter and more honest, and it was that part of her that spoke next. I'll take it, she said. All of it. The board seat, the veto power, the quarterly reviews, all of it. Adrian raised an eyebrow slightly. You didn't ask me a single question about the terms before agreeing. I have questions, Victoria said. I'm going to have a lot of them probably for the next 18 months. But I'm not going to waste this room negotiating myself out of the very oversight I just spent 3 weeks telling you and my own board that I needed. That would be exactly the kind of performance you've been watching for. Wouldn't it? Say the right things about accountability in front of the cameras, then quietly negotiate the actual accountability down to something more comfortable once it's just the 2 of us in a room and nobody else is watching. Something shifted in Adrian's expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it. The first genuine warmth she'd seen from him since that morning in the doorway of the Meridian room. "That's the first time in this entire conversation," he said, "that you've said something I didn't have to weigh against the possibility that you were performing it." They spent another hour going through the remaining details: the timeline for the first tranche, the structure of the quarterly reviews the specific outside firm Adrian wanted, brought in to help redesign the promotion process. It was, Victoria realized, somewhere in the middle of it, the first business conversation she'd had in years that didn't feel like a negotiation in the adversarial sense. Two parties trying to extract the most favorable terms from each other. It felt instead like two people building something neither of them entirely trusted, yet brick by careful brick testing each piece before setting the next one down. Near the end, as Adrian was gathering the pages back into an organized stack, Victoria found herself asking a question she hadn't planned to ask, one that had been sitting in her chest since the lobby 3 weeks ago and had never quite found its moment. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "You don't have to answer." Adrian looked up. "Go ahead. You said in the lobby that this has happened to you before, more than once. I've been thinking about that a lot these past 3 weeks, going through those exit interviews, hearing what my own employees went through without my ever knowing. And I keep wondering, how do you do it? How do you keep walking into rooms like mine over and over after everything you've said happened to you in rooms just like it?" Adrian was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the worn leather folder on the corner of his desk. "My grandfather worked at that plant for 40 years, he said finally. "Every single day he put on the same uniform and walked through the same gate, past people who never once in 40 years learned his name and called him whatever came easiest to them instead. He came home every night and never once, not one single time in my entire childhood, let me see him carry that bitterness into our house. I asked him once when I was maybe 14 how he did that. How he went back the next morning after a day like that and the morning after that for 40 years. Adrian's voice had gone quieter, more distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere further back than the office they were sitting in. "He told me the door only stays closed if you decide it's closed. Somebody else can shut it in your face. That's their choice, and it says everything about them and nothing about you. But whether you walk back up to the next one, that part's still yours." He said the day you let someone else's decision about one door become your decision about every door after it, that's the day they've actually won, even if they never know it. Victoria felt something tighten in her throat. "So, I keep walking up to the doors," Adrian continued. "Even the ones that close on me. Even the ones like yours did 3 weeks ago. Because the alternative is letting every closed door add up into a life I let other people build for me, one refusal at a time. And I decided a long time ago I wasn't willing to hand that much power to people who'd never even bothered to learn my name first." The office was quiet for a long moment, after that the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. "Thank you for telling me that," Victoria said finally. "I don't tell many people that," Adrian said. "I'm telling you because I think you need to understand exactly what was at stake in that boardroom 3 weeks ago. Not the money, not the deal. The thing you almost did without even realizing it was become one more closed door in a very long line of them. And I need you to carry that understanding into every decision you make for the next 18 months. Not as guilt, because guilt doesn't build anything. As a kind of attention. The specific, deliberate attention of someone who finally understands what it costs the person on the other side of that decision, even when they never see the cost themselves." Victoria left Carter Legacy Capital a little after 1 in the afternoon. The signed term sheet in her bag, alongside the folder of 11 names, now 12. Now she suspected walking out into the bright afternoon light, likely to become more before this was over. She called Daniel from the sidewalk outside the building, unable to wait until she was back at her own desk. "We have a deal," she said, and heard him exhale audibly on the other end of the line, a sound that carried 3 weeks of accumulated tension finally releasing all at once. Terms. "Better than you'll expect and harder than you'll expect both at the same time," Victoria said. "I'll explain everything when I'm back. Get Richard on the phone. He's going to want to see this before we announce anything. Victoria. Daniel's voice had gone quiet, almost unsteady. I have to say something, and I know this isn't the moment for sentiment, but I've worked for you for 11 years. I've never been prouder to than I am right now. Victoria stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the city moving around her, and let herself feel for the first time in 3 weeks something that wasn't dread or fear, or the low, constant hum of anxiety she'd been carrying since the moment the guard's hand had closed around Adrian Carter's arm. Thank you, Daniel, she said. I'll see you soon. She hung up and stood there a moment longer, looking back up at the modest brick building behind her, thinking about a man in a foreman's uniform walking through a gate every morning for 40 years, refusing to let a closed door become every door, and about the folder of 12 names sitting in her bag, now waiting for the work that still lay ahead of her work, that had only just begun, and that she understood with a clarity she hadn't possessed 3 weeks ago, would not end simply because a term sheet had been signed. The deal was done. The harder part, the part that would actually determine over the next 18 months whether any of this meant something or nothing at all, was only just starting. The announcement went out 2 days later, and this time Victoria insisted on standing in front of actual cameras to deliver it herself, rather than letting a press release speak for her. She stood at a podium in the Sterling Tower lobby, the same lobby where the video had been filmed weeks earlier, a detail she'd chosen deliberately over the strong objections of her communications team, who'd wanted a cleaner, more controlled setting for what should have been triumphant news. 3 weeks ago, she said, looking directly into the cameras instead of down at prepared notes. I made a decision in about 5 seconds that I will spend a long time trying to fully account for. I looked at a man standing in a doorway, and before he said a single word to introduce himself, I decided I already knew everything I needed to know about whether he belonged in that room. I was wrong. And in being wrong about him, I discovered I'd been wrong about a great deal more than just that one morning. She spoke for several minutes about the exit interviews, about the pattern the external review had already begun to surface about the terms of the new investment and exactly what oversight it carried without softening any of it into more comfortable corporate language. She did not use the word misunderstanding. She did not use the word regret more than once. She used instead the word wrong, repeatedly, deliberately, because she had decided in the 3 weeks since that morning that softer words were exactly the kind of thing that let a company like hers keep quietly building the same pattern for years without ever having to look at it directly. I judged a man before I let him finish a sentence, she said near the end. I confused what I expected someone to look like with what someone actually was. And I have learned in the weeks since that this wasn't a single mistake contained to one Tuesday morning. It was a pattern I built without ever choosing to one unexamined decision at a time for years. And I am only now beginning to understand how much it has cost people who worked for this company long before I ever met Adrian Carter. She paused, looking out at the assembled reporters, at the small crowd of her own employees who had gathered at the edges of the lobby to watch. I don't expect this to be over quickly. I don't expect anyone to simply trust that it's real because I stood here and said the right words. I expect to have to prove it every day for a long time, and I intend to. When she stepped down from the podium, Marcus Webb was standing near the front of the small crowd of employees, and he caught her eye and gave her a small, uncertain nod. Not quite approval, not yet, but something that had at minimum stopped being pure skepticism. It was Victoria understood exactly the response she deserved. Not celebration, not forgiveness handed over freely in a single afternoon because she'd finally said the hard things out loud in front of cameras. Just the beginning of something that would have to be earned slowly, one decision at a time, the same way the pattern that had led to that Tuesday morning had been built not all at once, but brick by brick over years, until it finally became visible enough for someone standing in a doorway to name it out loud. She had 90 days once. Now she had 18 months, a signed term sheet, a folder of names that would likely keep growing before it stopped, and a man who had told her in a quiet office with a worn leather folder resting on the corner of his desk that the door only stayed closed if you decided it was closed. She intended to keep walking back up to it, every single day for as long as it took, The first quarterly review happened on a gray Tuesday morning, almost exactly 3 months after the term sheet had been signed, and Victoria walked into the Meridian room that day with a different kind of nervousness than she'd carried the last time she'd stood at the head of that table, waiting for someone to walk through the glass door. Adrian arrived on time folder under his arm and took the seat that had been kept for him at the far end of the table, not at the head, and not in the position of a guest either, but somewhere in between the seat of a man who now had a legitimate claim to the room, and had never once in 3 months let anyone forget it, though he never raised his voice to remind them. "Walk me through the numbers first," he said. "Then walk me through the people, in that order every time. I want to know you're keeping both, not choosing one over the other because it's convenient." Victoria had learned over 3 months that this was simply how he operated. Precise, unhurried, never satisfied with a summary when a specific answer was available instead. She'd learned to prepare for these meetings the way she used to prepare for board sessions, except the preparation itself had changed her slowly in ways she was only beginning to recognize. The numbers that first quarter were modest, but real. A stabilized burn rate. 2 enterprise contracts renewed that had been on the edge of walking away entirely during the worst of the media coverage. A small but genuine uptick in the platform's core usage metrics that suggested the technology, freed finally from the panic and mismanagement of the failed product launch, was doing something closer to what it had always been capable of doing. The people were harder and took longer, and Victoria had come to understand that this was exactly the point. 14 names now, she said, sliding the updated folder across the table. 2 more surfaced this quarter through the review process. Both handled the same way as the others' direct outreach documented findings, consequences for anyone still at the company who was part of the pattern. "The senior manager from the Marcus Webb case," Adrian said. "Where does that stand?" "Terminated," Victoria said, not quietly. The findings were specific enough and confirmed enough that the board voted for full termination with cause, and I made sure that decision was documented as part of the public review, the same as everything else. Adrian made a note unhurried, then looked up. "And the promotion committee, the one with the outside members I insisted on. How many decisions has it actually overturned this quarter versus how many it's simply rubber-stamped?" 3 overturned out of 19 decisions reviewed, Victoria said. 2 of the 3 were promotions I would have approved myself 6 months ago, without a second thought. The committee flagged both for the same reason: strong performance reviews, but a documented pattern of the candidates' ideas being credited more readily in meetings than equally qualified colleagues whose contributions had been, in the committee's language, systematically underweighted. I sat in on both conversations. I understood, watching them happen in real time, exactly what you meant 3 months ago about needing someone in the room whose entire job was catching the thing I wouldn't have caught on my own. Something in Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but the specific, careful loosening of a man allowing himself cautiously to believe something he'd been unwilling to believe 3 months earlier. "You sat in on them," he said. "You didn't have to do that. The committee has full authority without you present." "I know," Victoria said. "I sat in because I decided a while ago that if I wasn't willing to actually watch the process work, then supporting it on paper didn't mean very much. I needed to see it myself, not to approve it. I don't have veto power over the committee anymore. You made sure of that. But because I think if I stop paying attention, the moment it becomes uncomfortable to watch, that's exactly the moment the whole thing quietly starts to erode." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something quieter, less like an oversight meeting, and more like the conversation they'd had in his office 3 months earlier when he'd told her about his grandfather and the gate he'd walked through for 40 years. "My grandfather used to tell me that anybody can hold a door open for the cameras," he said. "The real test is whether you're still holding it open on the days nobody's watching at all." He set his pen down. 3 months isn't very long, Ms. Harrington. I want to be honest about that, the same way I've tried to be honest with you since the day I walked out of your building with a security guard's hand on my arm. I don't know yet whether this is who you've actually become, or whether it's simply who you're being, while I still have a board seat and veto power and a folder of names sitting on this table every 90 days. 18 months from now, when this oversight ends, and it's just you running this company on your own instincts again, that's when I'll actually know." "I understand," Victoria said. "I think about that a lot, honestly. What happens when nobody's checking anymore? And what have you decided?" Victoria considered the question carefully, the way she'd learned to consider most things over the last 3 months, resisting the old instinct to answer fast and confidently before she'd actually examined what she believed. "I've decided I don't want to find out the answer by accident," she said finally. "I've asked Elaine Foster and 2 other board members to stay involved in the promotion committee's oversight permanently, not just for the 18 months your terms require. I've built the external reporting into our annual filings going forward, whether or not anyone requires it of us anymore. I don't fully trust myself not to slide back into old patterns if there's nothing structurally in place to catch me. I'd rather build the guardrails in permanently than gamble that 18 months of practice is enough to have actually rewired something that took me 2 decades to build without ever noticing I was building it." Adrian studied her for a long moment, and then, for the first time since that morning in the Meridian Room 3 months earlier, he allowed himself something that was unmistakably a smile, small, restrained, but real. "That's the first time," he said, "you've told me something about the future of this company that I didn't have to weigh against whether you were saying it because I was sitting in this room." The months moved forward, the way months do faster in memory than they'd felt while living through them. The external review, initially projected to take 6 months, stretched to 9, surfacing 4 more names before it finally concluded 18 in total. Each one handled with the same documented public accountability as the first 11. Each one a small specific repair to a pattern that had taken years to build and would take. Victoria understood by then far longer than 18 months to fully undo. Marcus Webb, the young engineer whose fix had been quietly credited to someone else, was promoted that autumn to lead a technical team of his own. Not as a symbolic gesture. Victoria made sure of that, but through the same promotion committee process that had by then overturned enough decisions and confirmed enough others that most of the company had stopped viewing it as an obstacle and started viewing it slowly as simply how things worked now. The product manager who had left for a competitor 8 months before the video ever surfaced never came back. She'd built something good where she'd landed, and Victoria understood by the second time they spoke that asking her to return would have been its own kind of unexamined assumption. The assumption that an apology alone entitled the company to what it had already lost. But she stayed in touch with Victoria over the following year in occasional emails, offering the kind of blunt, specific feedback about the review process that only someone who'd lived through the pattern from the inside could offer. And Victoria read every one of those emails carefully and changed things because of more than one of them. Richard Voss, the board chair, who had sat across from Victoria in the coldest boardroom meeting of her career, and told her plainly that this wasn't just a lost deal, but a question of character, retired from the board 11 months into the process. And at his final meeting, he said something to Victoria that she would carry with her long after. "I've chaired boards for almost 30 years. He told her, the room emptying out around them after the formal session ended. "I've watched a lot of executives handle a crisis. Most of them handle it exactly the way you'd expect: contain it, minimize it, wait for the news cycle to move on to someone else's mistake. What you did instead was rarer than I think you understand. You didn't just survive this. You let it actually change how the company operates, even when it would have been so much easier and so much less expensive not to." He paused at the door. "I don't say this often, Victoria, but I'm glad I didn't ask you to step down that afternoon. I came close. I want you to know that. But I'm glad I didn't." It was in the 14th month, on an ordinary Thursday that gave no warning of what it was about to become, that Adrian called Victoria's office directly, instead of routing through the usual scheduling channels the quarterly reviews normally used. "I want to show you something," he said when she picked up. "Not at your office, mine. This afternoon, if you can manage it." She arrived a little after 3 and found him at his desk with a single sheet of paper laid out in front of him, his grandfather's worn folder sitting as it always did on the corner of the desk. "Sit," he said. And she did. "I've been reviewing the 18-month terms," he said. "We're 4 months out from the oversight period, ending the veto power, the mandatory board seat, all of it. I wanted to talk to you before that clock runs out, rather than simply letting it lapse without a conversation." Victoria felt something tighten in her chest, an old familiar anxiety she'd thought she'd mostly outgrown over the past 14 months. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Adrian said slowly, "that I've spent 30 years building a career around a very specific instinct, the ability to tell the difference between someone who's performing accountability because they're being watched and someone who's actually internalized it whether or not anyone's checking. It's the single skill that's made my entire fund possible, and I don't say that lightly." He looked up at her directly. "And I have to tell you, Victoria, that somewhere in the last several months I stopped watching you the way I watch most of the companies I invest in. I stopped waiting for the moment the mask would slip. I don't fully know when it happened, but it happened." Victoria felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not quite relief. Something closer to being truly seen for the first time in longer than she could remember, not for what she'd built before that Tuesday morning 14 months ago, but for what she'd chosen to become because of it. "I'm not going to remove the board seat," Adrian continued. "I want to be clear about that, not because the terms require it anymore, but because I've come to believe over 14 months of sitting in that room that this company is better with a genuine outside voice in its leadership permanently. Not just while a contract requires it. I'd like to stay if you'll have me. Not as an obligation either of us is fulfilling, as a partner." Victoria sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of 14 months settle into something that felt for the first time less like penance and more like foundation. "I'd like that," she said. "I think this company is better with you in that room too. I don't think I fully believed 14 months ago that oversight could ever feel like anything other than punishment. I think you've taught me something different. And the veto power on senior promotions," Adrian said, "that I am removing. Not because the committee hasn't earned its authority. It has, and it should keep operating exactly as it does now independently, the way it's designed to. But because I think there's a difference between structural accountability that outlives any single relationship and my personal veto sitting over your shoulder indefinitely. The first is healthy. The second, I think, would eventually become its own kind of unhealthy dependency. You leaning on my judgment instead of trusting the judgment you've actually rebuilt in yourself these past 14 months. I don't think you need that particular safety net anymore. I think you've built your own." Victoria felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and she let it happen, not bothering to hide it the way the old version of her might have. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for all of it. For coming back that day when you didn't owe me anything. For the terms that made this actually hard instead of easy. For trusting me now, even though I know exactly how unlikely that trust is, given how we started." Adrian was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on the worn edge of his grandfather's folder. "I want to tell you something," he said, "that I haven't told you before in 14 months of sitting across tables from you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The morning your guard's hand closed around my arm, I made a decision, walking out of that building, that I was never going back. I told my assistant to cancel everything. I meant it fully in that moment. Whatever 6 months of studying your technology had built in me, whatever hope I'd let myself carry into that room against my own better judgment, it was gone by the time I reached the lobby doors." "I know," Victoria said. "You told me that in your lobby that night. What I didn't tell you," Adrian said, "is what changed my mind. It wasn't the 3 hours you sat in my lobby, though, that mattered. It wasn't even the honesty of what you said to me that evening, though that mattered too. It was something that happened 2 days after that, something you never knew about because I never told anyone at your company about it." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "What was it?" "I had my assistant quietly reach out to a few people who'd worked at your company and left," Adrian said. "Standard diligence, something I do before any deal regardless of circumstances. I wanted to know honestly whether what happened in your boardroom was an isolated moment or a pattern before I let myself even consider walking back through your doors. I spoke to 3 former employees myself directly off the record. And do you know what struck me listening to all three of them? Victoria shook her head slowly. None of them told me you were cruel, Adrian said. None of them described a tyrant or someone who set out to build the kind of company that Pattern eventually became. What they described, every one of them in slightly different words, was someone who moved too fast to ever look back and check what she'd left behind her. Someone who trusted her own instincts so completely that she'd never once built in a mechanism to question them. That's not the same thing as cruelty, Victoria. It's dangerous in its own way. Certainly dangerous enough that it built exactly the pattern those 18 names eventually revealed. But it's also, I came to believe, fixable in a way that actual cruelty rarely is. A person who's cruel has to become someone fundamentally different to change. A person who simply never learned to slow down and look, that person can learn, if she's willing. He met her eyes. I decided somewhere in those 3 conversations that I was willing to find out whether you were willing. That's what brought me back to that lobby the night you were waiting for me. Not forgiveness exactly. Curiosity, maybe. The specific cautious curiosity of a man who's learned over 30 years that some of the most valuable investments he's ever made were in people everyone else had already decided to write off, including on that particular morning myself. The office was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, the same kind that had settled between them in this room 14 months earlier, when he'd first told her about the gate his grandfather walked through for 40 years. 1 year and 2 months after the day, security had escorted Adrian Carter out of the Sterling Tower lobby. Harrington Technologies held its annual shareholder meeting in that same lobby. A deliberate choice. Victoria's now made, without any pushback from a communications team that had over the past 14 months come to understand exactly why their CEO made choices like that. Adrian arrived early, as he always did, his grandfather's folder under his arm, out of habit rather than necessity now, and Victoria met him at the entrance, extending her hand, the way she should have, the way she wished she had on the morning that had started all of this. He looked at her hand for a moment, not with hesitation exactly, but with the weight of memory, the particular gravity of a gesture that carried between the two of them the full distance of everything that had happened since the last time they'd stood in this exact spot. Then he shook it. Not because he'd forgotten what happened here. Victoria understood that clearly, standing there in the same lobby where a security guard's hand had once closed around this man's arm, while 11 of her own employees watched and said nothing. He hadn't forgotten. He would likely never entirely forget, and she had come to understand over 14 months of hard, deliberate work that this was not a debt any apology could fully discharge. Some doors once closed left a mark on the frame even after they opened again. But he shook her hand anyway because she had spent 14 months proving in ways both large and painstakingly small that the woman standing in this lobby today was not simply performing change for an audience that had long since stopped watching as closely as it once had. Later that afternoon, during the shareholder Q&A, a young reporter near the back of the room raised her hand and asked Adrian directly in front of the assembled crowd a question that had clearly been sitting unasked in a dozen previous interviews he'd quietly declined to give. "Mr. Carter, can I ask, why did you give her a second chance after everything that happened that first morning? A lot of people in your position would have simply walked away and never looked back." Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. "Because the world doesn't need more people who never make mistakes," he said. "That's an easy standard to hold, and it's also a fiction. Everyone makes mistakes. Some of them small, some of them the kind that make national news for a week. What the world actually needs, and what it gets far too rarely, are people who are brave enough to face what they did honestly in full view without flinching away from the hardest parts of it, and then do the slow, unglamorous work of actually changing long after the cameras have found some other story to cover. That's rare. It's rarer than good intentions. It's rarer, frankly, than most of the polished apologies I've watched executives deliver over 30 years in this business. Victoria Harrington earned this company's second chance the same way anyone earns anything worth having, not in the 5 seconds it takes to make a mistake, but in the 14 months it takes to actually repair what that mistake revealed. Victoria, standing near the podium, felt something settle in her chest that she recognized finally as something close to peace. Not the absence of the memory of that Tuesday morning, which she suspected she would carry for the rest of her career in some form, as a kind of permanent useful discomfort. But peace with the knowledge that she had not tried to erase what happened. She had tried instead to answer it fully honestly, one uncomfortable decision at a time for as long as it took. Later, after the shareholders had gone and the lobby had emptied out into the ordinary quiet of an evening, Victoria found herself standing near the same spot where she'd once stood at the head of a boardroom table and told a security guard to remove a stranger from her building before he'd finished a single sentence. She thought about young entrepreneurs she'd begun speaking to over the past year at conferences and business schools that had started asking her cautiously at first, and then with more genuine interest to share what she'd learned. She thought about the thing she always told them, near the end of every talk, the sentence that had become, without her ever planning it, the closest thing she had to a personal creed. Success doesn't reveal who you are when people can do something for you, and everyone in the room already respects what you've built. Anyone can be gracious under those conditions. It reveals who you are in the moment you decide someone standing in front of you has nothing left to offer you, no deal to close, no favor, to earn no leverage over your future at all. And you have to choose in that unwatched, unrewarded moment how you're going to treat them anyway. She had failed that test once spectacularly publicly in under 5 seconds in front of 11 witnesses and eventually in front of a country watching a 31-second video online. But she had spent every day since trying to answer for it, not because a contract required her to, not because a board demanded it, not even in the end because Adrian Carter was watching, but because she had finally understood standing in that same lobby a year later with her hand extended and genuinely meant that the true measure of a person was never the mistake itself. It was everything they chose to become because of it. And on that score, at last, Victoria Harrington had something she could stand behind fully, without flinching, without performance, without a single word left to prove.